Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us this week for another episode of the Church and Culture Podcast. Now, although Christianity can sometimes get a bad rap when it comes to the treatment of women, particularly when it involves leadership roles, the fact of the matter is that Christianity's promotion of the value of women during its inception really is what resulted in flocks of women joining the church. In fact, throughout history, women have predominated the church in number. That might be changing, though. A recent survey conducted by the Survey Center on American Life found that women in America are leaving the church in unprecedented numbers. Now, before we get to the why behind that, Jim, can you give some highlights from that report?
Yeah, and I think people are going to be really surprised by this. If it doesn't become a topic of conversation in circles, I think it's because it's theologically fraught with danger or something. I don't know, but it's a major issue. Over the last couple of decades, with the rise of the nuns and the de-churching of America, it was men, largely more than women, who were exiting the church. In fact, for years, if you've tracked with this, polling has consistently shown that men had lower levels of religious engagement. But now that pattern has reversed, specifically among younger generations. Of all the Gen Z adults who left their formative religion, or the religion they were raised in, if you will, of all the adults that left, 54% were women and only 46% were men. When you look at the four most recent generations, and this really kind of puts it in a startling context, we'll bracket off Generation Alpha and Generation Beta, obviously Beta, because of just due to age. Beta hasn't even turned 1 month yet. But among baby boomers and Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, with each generation, you skew younger. As you skew younger, the percentage of women leaving the church increases, and the percentage of men leaving the church decreases. Until you get to Generation Z, when finally the scales tip entirely and you have more women than men leaving the church. So here's a breakdown. I brought some of this with me so I would get the percentages right. Of all the adults who have left their formative faith or their childhood religion, among baby boomers, 43% were women. Among Gen X, 45% were women. Among millennials, 47% were women. And when you get to Generation Z, 54%, the majority, were women. That's a headline, but there's more. If you drill down deeper and you just don't look at those who left their childhood religion, but those who have become completely unaffiliated with any religion, they didn't just leave their childhood religion and go to something else. They became a nun, if you will. Women are leading there too. Young women are less religious than young men. I mean, just saying that sentence seems so strange, I think, to people who've been walking with this for a long time, like I have. But young women are less religious than young men. 39% of all Gen Z women identify as a nun, religiously unaffiliated, compared to only 34% of Gen Z men. Now, to get a sense of how dramatic that shift is, again, let's do some intergenerational comparisons. Compare that to the percentage of baby boomer women who fall into that category. Like how many nuns, how many religiously unaffiliated are there among baby boomer women? You got 39% of Gen Z women who are in that category. Only 14% of baby boomer women are in that category that would identify that way. So this is a massive cultural shift driven by a massive generational difference between young women and older women. And this is a headline.
Well, as unprecedented as it is, I thought it was interesting how New York Times opinion writer Jessica Gross wrote that this was very predictable. And I'm
Mhm.
sure she's not the only one who saw the writing on the wall. So, Jim, what factors have led to this recent departure of women?
I don't think anybody watching what's been going on with the church of the last, particularly even just 10, 15 years, but just what's happening in culture, I don't think anybody should have been surprised by this. I think I wasn't surprised by the de-churching. I was surprised a little bit by the more of them now would consider themselves nothing. That one surprised me a little bit, but not the leaving the church. First, let me unpack this. The vast majority of Gen Z women identify, and this is a broad label that can be defined in a lot of ways, but this is the way surveys tend to ask them: would you consider yourself a feminist? The vast majority of Gen Z women would say, yes, I am, far greater than any of the other generations. They're concerned deeply about the unequal treatment of women. As a result, they're much more suspect and critical of any institution, not just the church, any institution that upholds any kind of what they would be perceived as not just a traditional social arrangement, but a traditional social arrangement that is misogynist, that does not treat women equally. As you would imagine, 65% of all Gen Z women believe that churches fall into that category, that they do not treat men and women equally. Uh, look at it from their perspective. It's not like they're wrong. I mean, many denominations do not allow women, and it doesn't matter whether you think it's theologically correct or not. Look at it from the eyes of a woman staring at the church from outside the stained glass windows. Many denominations do not allow women to serve in leadership positions, or to have much of in the way of any type of formal authority or decision making, directors or pastors or anything. The Southern Baptist Convention is the most well known for this. They've been the most public. They've gotten the most press for it. While having shrunk dramatically in size in recent years, they're still the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And they have doubled down on this over the last few years. I mean, I cannot stress enough how much they have really just doubled down. Even kicking out churches that have women, not simply as pastors, like a senior pastor, but any woman who functions pastorally or just carries the name pastor in their title, or even associate pastor in their title, or or if they're teaching or preaching, even if they're under the leadership of a male senior pastor, and that church's theology says that the senior pastor should be male, we're kicking churches out over that. Now, play that out against a few other cultural dynamics, namely that Gen Z in particular were absolutely raised to believe they can do anything a man can do. I mean, you kind of want a theme movie for them. These gals were raised on Mulan. I mean, that's their thing. But that's not all. Young women today are more educated than men their age. They have greater professional ambition. They're more concerned with personal success and growth. In fact, a recent Pew poll found that it was young men more than women who wanted to become a parent. That's new. You got more young guys saying, I want children, than you have young gals. There was one interview highlighted by the report of a woman who had left the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC. And she said, and I brought this with me because I thought this was interesting. She said, there's tremendous cognitive dissonance for a woman of faith who is leading professionally or through volunteer efforts when she experiences the glass ceiling and walls in her place of worship. It just makes the way some churches and denominations engage women or allow women to engage them difficult and, from their perspective, very off-putting, very, very alienating. And that's what the numbers are obviously showing. Rather than falling into place, they are simply leaving the place. But that's not all. I mean, again, in these podcasts, we're trying to expand our thinking and have it be more than just a blog conversation and, heaven forbid, a tweet. It's not just about gender. It's about theology. They reject the theology behind the gender hierarchy. It's not just cultural, it's theological. Sure it is. Because you have very devout Christian women who are part of this, departure of some of these types of churches. They reject the theology behind this. They also reject the theology. And again, right or wrong, we're not getting into that. We're not being evaluative in that sense. We're being descriptive. We're trying to understand what's going on. They also reject the theology behind the idea that personhood begins at conception, as opposed to, say, the start of the second trimester. The majority of Gen Z women are in favor of abortion being legalized. That's been well documented. The majority of women believe abortion should be available during the first trimester, a stance at least during the first trimester, and that's a stance many churches do not embrace at all. They are also supportive of the right to pursue in vitro fertilization. That's something that, for example, the SBC just came out and condemned. So they also don't like the way the church has often treated people of color and people of same-sex attraction. There is a sense that churches negatively treat gay and lesbian people, and it's also well documented that the average Gen Z person knows at least one gay person, and so this isn't, this is personal to them in that how they're treated. Anyone who has studied Gen Z knows that the one cardinal virtue that they have is inclusion. I mean, that's just like the cardinal virtue. Even if, and this is what's interesting, and this is where I really want to push our listeners to think, even beyond what we've already raised. Even if they are theologically conservative, this Gen Z woman who's leaving the church, even if they're theologically conservative and hold to historic Christian orthodoxy on matters of sexual expression and sexual identity, they don't like the way the church has acted relationally with the world. Again, even if they might agree with the church's stance, they don't like the way the church has taken that stance. They've got too many images of people picketing outside with a big sign that says God hates fags. And they don't think God hates fags. They certainly don't hate fags, and they also don't like anyone calling them fag. I mean, the word itself is offensive. You might as well use the N word, So you pull all of this together, okay? Churches in their mind do not value them. They do not treat them as equal. And it's insulting to them. It's not, they are theologically more moderate than current expressions of conservative theology, or at least more nuanced, on such matters as abortion and the way the church should be interacting with people of color as well as the LGBTQ community. Particularly when, unlike older generations, they have friends who are of other races and friends who might be gay. Again, before you say, so that all we're talking about is just women are going liberal. That's the headline. Women are just liberal. They're jettisoning the Christian faith. No. Be careful. These sentiments would include women who actually hold what would be considered highly conservative views, such as that women should be able to serve as pastors and teach, though they might say, I think the senior pastors should be male exclusive, but I think women should be allowed to preach and teach and lead and pastor and such. They'll say that while abortion should be made legal during the first trimester, they don't think abortion should take place after the 12-week mark. And that the LGBTQ community should be met with love and respect while still viewing homoerotic behavior as outside of God's will. In mainstream culture, that's pretty conservative thinking. It really is. Very conservative thinking. But they're finding there's not many churches that are welcoming to that, even to those kind of nuances. They feel like the church treats these subjects and them with just a blunt instrument. And as a result, there's just not a place for them there, they feel.
Yeah. Well, let's play this forward then. What effect do you think that fewer women in the church will have, if not are already having, on churches? And I also want to add, and on families.
Yeah. This is happening in real time, so we don't know, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to forecast it if you know anything about how women have been serving the church historically. For someone who's been a part of serving in ministry in church for decades and watching things also closely on the cultural front, I don't think it's hard to state what is obvious. First, I think there will be the continued departure of women. I don't think we're going to, particularly among Gen Z and the generations coming, Alpha and Beta. I think you'll find the continued departure of women, and as a result, churches that they're rejecting, if you will continue to decrease in size. These churches will lose out on what has been the strongest arm of volunteering historically. Women were the backbone of the church. You call any pastor on the planet right now and say, who does the most serving in your church, women or men? I defy you. It's going to come by 99% of all churches in America. Women work harder and they've got more skin in the game. I'm not putting men down. It's just that, man, that's just been, the historical norm. Women were the backbone of the church, and without them, the church would just suffer greatly. So there's an irony here that, I hope that we're mature enough to point out and just realize about this whole conversation. Those who are doubling down on women in any kind of leadership or teaching role still have those women functioning as teachers or leaders in everything but name only. And they have to, because the church couldn't survive otherwise. So I don't know whether you want to call that an irony or just being disingenuous, but that's what's happening. I mean, you take a program like Sunday school, okay? Who are most of the teachers in Sunday school? Women, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Another dynamic will be a dramatic loss in giving. Women are often, right now, they're tearing it up in the marketplace and in earnings. Churches will find themselves resource starved without women. I mean, I just can't think, Alexis, of a single metric, a single missional endeavor that's not going to suffer greatly if there really is a departure of women from the life of the church. And you mentioned the effect on families. I mean, again, historically, I mean, I don't know which way you were going with that, procreation or just children in the church. But if you just go with children in the church, historically, I mean, who is it that was bringing their families to church? Who brought their children to church? It was the mother. It didn't tend to be the father historically. So, and the whole procreation thing, I mean, that probably too much for us to bite off. But if you do have men wanting to be parents and women not wanting to be parents, and women being more advanced in the marketplace and financially independent, and men sometimes having younger men a failure to launch, which we've had an entire podcast or two on exploring those kinds of dynamics, it's going to have an impact on marriage and family as well. So with the departure of women, I mean, should make a lot of people concerned.
Yeah. Well, let's start talking about answers, solutions. The American Survey Center was a little bit dire. They suggested that these women who have left, they are gone for good. Mm-hmm. I hope that's not true, but is there a way that churches can become more welcoming places for women?
Yeah, but the ones that aren't don't have any interest in it. I mentioned they're doubling down and actually being more and more and more restrictive, even in ways they weren't before. But let me back up though. If you're a woman, if you're a church that is refusing to allow women any kind of seat at the table, I'm not sure there's a lot to offer the women who left over that. I really don't. Particularly when most who have left and become unaffiliated tend to stay that way, no matter what. And that's been pretty much proven that once someone really becomes unaffiliated, constantly leaves the church and leaves faith and says, I'm now a nun, that's a hardcore nut to crack. It really is, because it usually took some time and there was a lot of deep alienation that led to that, and deep, just a lot of, they were just, there was a reason they left. But I think the churches can be much more welcoming to women, even in the context of a theology that upholds differing roles for men and women in Scripture. And I'm going to go at it that way, but I'll tell you why. Churches that are already egalitarian in their theology, which means they feel like there's no differences at all. That men and women there's absolutely no differences in responsibilities or roles or in anything. are not alienating women over that. Okay. Complementarian churches that believe that men and women are equal in God's eyes but fulfill different roles, um, uh, so many of them are so doubling down and taking what used to be a wider understanding of complementarianism and making it narrow and narrower and narrower and narrower, and are intent on doing it because they're linking it to liberalism. They're linking it like in fact, I've even heard some people, which I just don't get, that churches' embrace of women in ministry, even in a conservative context, is what has led to a decline, for example, in the SBC. And they feel like the way the SBC is going to turn around is to get narrower and narrower and narrower, which I just scratch my head over that one. I mean, even if you embrace that theology from a church growth standpoint, I don't understand that's not what is causing the decline in the Southern Baptist Convention. They've got other issues that are more significant than that are causing the decline. But bracketing those two off, since that neither one of those are really kind of up in the air, let me talk about what a conservative church could do that may be complementarian somewhat in its makeup or DNA, because it is hard to escape differing roles to some degree in the scriptures. And we've had a whole podcast on this that we'll link to about women in ministry. But I think that churches can be more welcoming to women, even in the context of a theology that upholds differing roles for men and women in Scripture. For example, think about a church that is, and I alluded to this just a minute ago, but let me tease it out specifically. Let's talk about a church that is complementarian in its outlook, kind of broad, historic, complementarian viewpoint, meaning that it believes that the Bible teaches that men and women are completely equal in God's eyes, but have in some areas different roles. And say the family or the church in terms of leadership and authority and responsibility. Let's say that as a result, that church holds to the idea that to uphold that symbolically is to maintain that the senior pastor should be a male. Okay. We'll bracket off all the biblical reasons and arguments for landing there, but let's just say that's where you land. Okay. Couldn't that mean that women can teach and lead and speak and serve in any way they are gifted, as long as it doesn't violate God's order in the church? In other words, if that is maintained, couldn't a woman serve in a pastoral role and be ordained to ministry? The key is whether they serve under the authority of Scripture and as a member of a pastoral team whose leader is a male, as a contemporary symbol of God's designed order for the church. If that's in place, could it be that there are no barriers? As a result, that church could have women on staff and women in leadership and women serving as trustees and women teaching classes and on the weekends and yes, even as pastors and preaching and such. There are no barriers in light of an overarching biblical authority. My point is that even in the context of a complementarian view, women could have full access to the life and ministry of the church. And I think most women would find that much more welcoming than a view that seems terrified to have them even be seen as a teacher or leader. Anyway, like I said, we've done a podcast on women in ministry. We'll link to that in the show notes, where you and I had a longer conversation about this. But I think to some, having women in ministry and leadership is critical for any church who wants to reach women. So, yeah, I mean, that's one way of going forward.
Well, let's shift over to men for a second, because you had mentioned earlier that we're more familiar with a script of men abandoning the faith or being less interested spiritually. But that's not what's currently happening, or at least that's not what
Can I stop you before we go there?
Yeah.
I just thought of something that I want to add. I'll tell you another way churches can really just help a lot. You can have everything right on paper. You can do all this stuff, and still sexism runs amok. And I think that this isn't just the stuff that came out with Me Too. I really do believe there's a lot of just raw sexism, condescending attitudes, patronizing attitudes, because you can be like all for women in ministry and still be sexist, and have a woman and a man in the same position and the woman gets paid less, or all kinds of stuff like that. I'm reading a book right now, Malcolm Gladwell's latest book. It's called The Revenge of the Tipping Point. And he's got a point in there about how what a difference it makes on various boards and teams and such when there's just one woman present versus three. That how there's less condescension to the woman, that a woman's perspective is heard more and respected more, and when there's not more representation. So if you've got a staff, say of 10 men and 10 people, 9 men, 1 woman, there's just almost a sexist condescension that's going toward that woman. But if you have a staff of 7 men, 3 women, it radically changes. And so I do think it's not just having all this on paper. It's really trying to weed out sexism and actively trying to bring women on board in key leadership and director roles and pastoral roles. And so I would argue for that. And that changes the complexion of the church too. It's kind of like when if you were a lily white church, how weird it would feel for a family of color to come to a weekend, and there's no one that looks like them. There's no one on stage that looks like them. They just feel very odd. But if they drive onto the parking lot and they see diversity, and there's people there that are white and black and brown and all kinds, and there's a sense of, oh, okay. And so just like if a woman comes to a church and there's women speaking, or maybe women teaching and women on staff, and it's like, oh, there's people like me here, and I could have a place here. I could make a difference with my life here. And that matters. That matters. Okay, I interrupted. What was your question?
No, just tell me about men. What's going on with men? Because
we're a strange bunch. The opposite. The opposite. As mentioned, as you skew younger in the generational groupings, less and less men are leaving. More are actually finding faith and becoming active in the church. But I will say that, and that's among the younger generation. I will say that they're looking for a particular kind of faith. I think they're looking for a particular kind of church. They're looking for something that will help them understand themselves, will affirm their masculinity, help them understand their masculinity, make sense of what it means to be a man in today's world, challenge them to be the man God called them to be. They're looking for a place that will be challenging to them. Traditionally, and I'm going to go back, most churches were unintentionally oriented toward women. They really were. The messages, the ministries, the outreach, the decor, the videos, it really built around a woman's sensibilities. Part of that reason was because the volunteer base of the church was so overwhelmingly female, that was just naturally the case. How are we going to decorate the vestibule? Well, since it's basically led by women, the decoration choice was made. And so even the music, it used to be joked that there was a lot of music in the feminization of the church, where there were all these praise choruses that were like singing Jesus is my boyfriend, which, a guy singing that kind of a love song, it just wasn't appealing. There's again, an irony in all of this that I know you can already see and feel, taste and smell. Churches were structured for women in the past, and as a result, lost a lot of men. But then they turned around and alienated women, particularly younger women. So they ended up with neither. But the return of men now, particularly younger men, is happening, but with just a select group of churches. I'm going to say the obvious: churches that appeal to men. And that doesn't mean they're misogynistic churches. It doesn't mean they're churches that treat women as second-class citizens. It's not like that kind of it's not that. It's that they're just they can identify with the pastor or leaders, like a guy's guy or a fellow man, and the topics that are being addressed and how they're addressed. And I don't know. There's just an ethos that can be attractional.
Well, based on what you said, then there's an interesting dynamic at play because it seems like women are and again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but women are looking for churches that elevate the roles of women, and it seems like men are looking for a non-feminized faith. These feel like incompatible goals, but are they not?
They're not. It's not an either or. It's a both and. And I'm glad that you phrased that question that way. Churches that help men understand what it means to be a man and let them be a man of faith who makes a difference with his life. Men are hungry for that. And you don't have to have a feminized church to reach women. They're not looking for a feminized church. They're looking for a church that values them as women. There's a difference. I mean, in fact, you ask the average woman, so do you want a women's ministry? Do you want us to do these kinds of things? It's like, I would like a seated, I'd like to make a difference. I've got this gift. I'd like to put it into play, and I'd like to be valued and not treated as a second-class citizen. I'm, don't stereotype what I'm wanting. And so I do think it's you're not needing a feminized version of the church. Just value them as women. So churches can celebrate men and their masculinity and help them sort out what it means in light of who God has called them to be, and have them fulfill their roles and responsibilities, and make it clear what those are. And at the same time, celebrate women and their gifts and their intellect and their abilities, and let them be as instrumental and used by God as anybody else. Those two things together, to me, sounds dangerously New Testament. That's the way it was, and I think that's what you find with Jesus, and what he pulled together with his collection of men and women, and how he treated them. The way he elevated women, the way he treated them with such respect and honor, and what he entrusted them with, such as Mary with the whole proclamation of his resurrection, and so many other things. I mean, and the way, even in the New Testament, how Paul's letters and how he would honor women at the end of many of those letters, and honoring them as leaders and teachers and such. And then also he poured into men and helped them, man up, if you will, and what their responsibilities are in this world. And so it was a beautiful thing that I think what men hungered for and what women hungered for, and coming together in this picture of community on mission. And so I refuse to believe that this is not possible, because I do believe it's the dream of the church.
Well, it's interesting to talk about this at the beginning of the year, and just to see how this unfolds. I wonder if this is something that we'll come back to in a couple of months. It feels a little bit newer on the scene, but as you said, it's a headline for sure. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that this, I hope that a lot of conversation comes from this. And yeah, awesome. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you next week.